Hey everybody, welcome back to the next episode of Creating a Quick Great Tone, where I kind of go back into topics I've talked about in previous videos and revisit them in a much more condensed fashion. Today we're going to talk about a question that I get a lot and a topic I see discussed a lot, and that is the use of low and high cut EQs in our Helix presets. What are they? How do we use them? And do we need to add them to all of our presets? Well, we're going to take a look at that today. So let's head over to Cubase and take a look. So first things first, what I have here is just a little dry guitar part that I had recorded, a little quick riff. Just DI'd into my IK Multimedia Axe.io audio interface. And what I did is I just added an instance of Helix native to it so that it sounds like this. All I have is a Placator Dirty amp model going into a Greenback 25. You'll notice right now I have the low and high cuts off. And I also have an EQ block here, which is a low and high cut EQ block. And both of those are off as well. But first and foremost, before we talk about this, we have to understand what a low and a high cut is. To do that, I find that it helps to look at it from a visual standpoint. So to do that, I pulled up an instance of frequency EQ in Cubase. Now, this is an EQ that I can be very flexible with. But if you notice here, if I turn on the number 1 and number 8 bands, I have these set to cuts. And you'll see here the choices are cut 6, cut 12, cut 24, 48, and 96, and I can do the same on both. Now, first and foremost, what we can see here is when we choose a frequency, and right here I could say, put in 100 hertz. Well, you'll see that this cutoff point number 1 has changed to be a sloping down of all the frequencies below the frequency that I chose, which in this case is 100 hertz. Now you might say, well, what is the cut 6? Well, that means that this is cutting 6 dB per octave. So for every octave in our frequency domain, this is rolling off 6 decibels. If I move that to 12, it's going to cut off 12 dB per octave. And you can see the slope got more dramatic. 24, it's even more dramatic. 48, more dramatic. And 96, almost a straight line down. So it's pretty much eliminating all the frequencies in a very dramatic fashion below 100 hertz. But I find that this helps with the visual. Same thing over here on our high cuts, right? So I have this set, let's say let's set that at 8 kilohertz or 8,000 hertz. This is going to roll it off at 6 dB per octave, 12 dB per octave, 24, 48, and 96. So I find that this visual really helps us to understand what it is doing. So basically we're eliminating all of this here in the colored block. It's rolling all of those frequencies off. Same with here on the low end. So a low cut will roll off all the frequencies below the frequency that we set, and the high cut will roll off all the frequencies above the frequency that we set. And depending on our setting for how dramatic a slope it's going to be, how dramatic it cuts those off, we can see it's going to leave some frequencies intact. Say, for instance, the 12 dB per octave versus the 96 dB per octave. You see here at 10 kilohertz, we basically have nothing left here on the visual. But when we have a 12 dB per octave, we do. So as a visual, that's what's happening when we're using high and low cut EQs. You might question what that has to do with Helix. And for this, I'm using Helix native. Same blocks, same way of working. Now, I have a low and a high cut block here. So it allows us to roll off, as we can see, the low cut anywhere from being turned off all the way up to 1 kilohertz, and the high cut from being off all the way down to 1 kilohertz as well. So we can do some pretty dramatic cuts. Now, the thing it doesn't tell us is how many dB per octave. Now, I know that information is out there somewhere. I'm not certain exactly. One thing I do know, though, is if we use a low and high cut, either in a parametric EQ block, which we have here, or in just a straight, simple low and high cut EQ block, this is going to be a higher number of dB per octave than if we use it within the cab block. And I'm going to illustrate this in a second. And that's a very important point because a lot of folks seem to think that these are equal. We have to do a little bit more dramatic cut in the cab block to get similar results to if we are using a dedicated EQ block. Okay, so first and foremost, what does this sound like? Well, I thought having a loop here just going over and over again would be a good way to illustrate how this sounds using our ears and giving it an actual listen to hear exactly what's happening. So let's start off with the EQ block. You'll notice I have the cab block set as off. The low cut and high cut are both off. So we're going to use the low cut and the high cut here. So I am going to play my audio and I'm going to roll this off gradually. And I would like you guys just to listen in. And hopefully you're listening on a good set of speakers, because I want to see when you sort of start to hear the difference in the preset. And also look for your preference, because a lot of this really does come down to preference. Okay, so let's try this. All right, what do you guys think? I think that gives a pretty clear audible indication of what these low and high cuts do. So we can really hear how the high cut rolls off those high frequencies, the low cut rolls off those low frequencies. And once we understand what it's doing, we can then kind of come from a place of being educated about it and knowing in advance what particular settings might actually do. So having said that, the question is, do I need these in my presets? Well, what are some of the reasons someone might use this? Well, you might have a preset that sounds kind of edgy on the top end and you want to tame that. Maybe there's something that's a little bit boomy on the bottom end and you want to tame that, so we could use the low and high cut in those situations. Sometimes recording engineers will just roll off frequencies that are considered kind of not needed in a particular tone. An electric guitar doesn't have a lot of frequencies. Up high here, a guitar speaker is kind of designed in a way where it rolls off a lot of those frequencies. But that doesn't mean there's no audio information up here. So sometimes in a recording engineer may say, well, I don't want the guitar getting in the way of the cymbals on the drums, which does take up some sonic space up in the upper frequency. So they may roll off, down to 10 kilohertz, 12 kilohertz, 8 kilohertz even, just to open up that space for the instruments that do need it. Same with the low cut. Maybe we'll do a low cut at 90 or 100 hertz to sort of make room for the kick drum and the bass guitar and just clean up any of that information in the guitar that's not really benefiting us. But those are decisions that each person is going to have to make at that given moment. Now let's do this. Let's compare a high cut at 5 kilohertz on an EQ block to a 5 kilohertz setting on the cab block. So what I've done here is I've set up a snapshot. Snapshot 2 is going to be the cab block set at 5 kilohertz, and on snapshot 1 it's going to be set to off. On snapshot 1, though, the EQ block is going to be engaged, and on snapshot 2, it'll be off. So basically, snapshot 1 is going to be a 5 kilohertz high cut on the EQ block, and snapshot 2 is going to be a 5 kilohertz cut on the cab block and no EQ block in there. This is to illustrate the difference in that dB per octave slope that we were talking about. So let's start off with the cab block being on and listen to our track again. Do you hear the difference? Pretty dramatic. So the problem is a lot of folks would think, well, I'll just come to my cab block, I'll free up a block within my preset. Maybe we're using an HX stomp, we don't have blocks to spare. And I'll make the same setting on the high cut. And it's not really going to give us anywhere near the same result as we could hear. The EQ block is a much more dramatic slope to it and rolls that off much more. So it rolls off a lot more frequencies above the frequency that we set. So to get this closer then, I would probably say, what if we come over to the cab block and maybe roll it back to, let's say, 3 kilohertz? We're not going to get it to sound identical, but it's probably going to get it more in the ballpark. And let's compare those two now. That is much closer, really, when we do that. Now, I'm not saying it's identical because it's going to be a completely different slope, but what it shows us is that if we are going to use the cab block for our high cuts or low cuts, we're going to have to be a little bit more dramatic with the more set it a little bit lower to get a similar outcome. So that brings up the question, do we need it? Well, I've already answered that partially. If we're recording, maybe we do want to roll off the highs just to free up some space for other elements in the mix that it could possibly get in the way of. But again, that's going to be up to us. We'd have to use our ears. I mean, sometimes we can do these things within a mix and listen back and in a blind test, let's say, not even be able to tell the difference. But we are going to have to use our ears. Now, I know a lot of folks will make the suggestion of rolling way off. And, there is a danger in that we lose a lot of maybe the sizzle that we need in a guitar tone to cut in a mix. So the danger of going too low on a high cut is that maybe we're not going to cut in the mix quite as nicely. And maybe it'll sound nice when we're just playing in a room by ourselves. It smooths the sound out, and that's fine too. So in that situation of playing sort of in your room by yourself, just jamming, maybe we do want to go a little lower if we like the sound of that smoothness. But really, as a lot of these things come down to, it's really going to be up to our own personal preference. But when using it in a mix, we want to be careful with the high cut to not go too low so that we lose sort of that presence in the mix and that ability to cut through. I usually start all my presets off at a default setting just around 12 kilohertz, and I go from there. Sometimes I just leave it right where it is once I try it in a mix and realize this is working really well. Other times I may pull it back to 10 kilohertz, and I've even gone as low as, maybe even 7, really depending on what we're trying to accomplish. Now, as far as the low cut goes, a lot of times I start off anywhere between 80 and 100 hertz, and usually that just cleans up some of that bottom end that I don't need in there, and it does a nice job. Oftentimes I use the EQ block. If I am doing a stomp preset, a lot of times I will use the cab block and just be aware of the less dramatic settings and maybe go a little more extreme on my settings just to have it match more or in the ballpark of what an EQ block would be. And I would do that on a stomp just simply because I'm trying to save the blocks and give myself more blocks for other purposes. So what's the ultimate conclusion? Well, really, again, it's going to come down to personal preference at the end of the day, depending on our situation. As I mentioned, if we're sitting in a room playing and we want something that doesn't have much edge to it and we want to bring that high cut fairly far down, or maybe we also just want a really fat, beefy sound and playing by ourselves, we just have no low cut on because we like this big thud of what the bottom end is giving us. But we have to be aware that maybe that's not going to work in the context of a studio mix or even a live mix. Maybe we're stepping on the toes of the bass guitarist or the kick drum now, so we may want to roll off some of those lows. But again, there is no right or wrong answer. I think the important point here is we want to be aware of what these tools do, knowing that the cab block high and low cuts are far less dramatic than the EQ block goes a long way to knowing how to instinctively make our settings. And that's an important thing to know. And just understanding that visual that I showed of what these low and high cuts are doing helps us to get our head kind of around what is actually going on, which again is an important point. It allows us to be, like I mentioned before, more instinctive about just grabbing our settings and knowing where to go. Do a little experiment like I just did today. Play a loop through and roll the low and high cuts around to hear what suits your ear and your situation. Try that in a mix, try it out of a mix and see what works. I would caution though against going to massively extreme settings. I've seen some people suggest, doing high cuts all the way down to 3 kilohertz, and that's fine if you like the outcome, but you are running the risk of losing some presence that could be very important to helping us cut in the mix. Having said all of that, it really depends on what your tone is to begin with. I'm using a 121 ribbon mic in this example, which is going to be a darker tone and not have as much of that sort of sizzly high end, whereas somebody who's using an SM57 or a dynamic mic of that sort may have more sizzle they need to cut out. So it's really going to also depend on what we start with, but ultimately it comes down to our personal preference and using our ears to get the results that we want. But just having the knowledge we talked about today going into it helps us to speed up our workflow. So I hope that was useful, and I hope I covered everything in there. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you think would gain some benefit from it, and please subscribe to my channel and hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I'll be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Ciao for now.